Hello everyone. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, and let's go.
The most dangerous lies are not the ones told in whispers, but the ones hidden behind a life that looks perfect from the outside. While one man was busy building an empire, the silence in his own home was being filled by a shadow from the past. Let us analyze the subtle warning signs of emotional drift and the psychological trap of a successful marriage that most men overlook until the illusion shatters. For educational purposes only. In the quiet gated communities of Orange County, California, Sarah's life looked like the gold standard of the American dream. She had a sprawling Mediterranean-style home with a saltwater pool and a massive backyard, two beautiful children, Sam and Grace, and the kind of steady high six-figure income provided by her husband James that ensured they never had to want for anything. But behind the perfectly manicured hedges and the designer furniture, there was a hollow space Sarah could no longer ignore. Every day started like a pre-written script. The iPhone alarm went off at 6:30 a.m. sharp. Then came the frantic morning rush, packing school lunches with organic snacks from Whole Foods, the school drop-off in the white Ford Expedition, and then the long echoing hours of silence in a house that felt more like a Zillow listing than a place where people actually lived. James was a high-powered vice president at a major tech firm in the Irvine spectrum, and his job demanded every ounce of his soul. He was out the door before the sun was up and back long after the kids were in bed. Even when he was physically home, he was buried in his MacBook or taking emergency calls on the patio. Sarah couldn't remember the last time they had shared a conversation that lasted more than 2 minutes without him checking his Slack notifications. That Friday evening, when James shot her a quick text saying he'd be stuck in a late-night strategy session, Sarah felt a sharp sting of disappointment followed by a strange guilty sense of relief. It meant she would be heading to the annual local charity gala alone. They used to attend these events as a power couple, at least in the early days, but lately, James either found a corporate excuse or simply let the date slip his mind entirely. She pulled out her favorite navy silk dress, the one James used to love back when he still noticed what she wore. Her hair fell in soft, honey blonde waves over her shoulders, and she kept her makeup light, highlighting a face that was still remarkably youthful. The grand ballroom at the Marriott was packed to the rafters. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the constant clinking of champagne flutes. Sarah grabbed a glass of chilled Chardonnay and scanned the crowd for familiar faces, bracing herself for the usual superficial small talk about school districts and the exhausting pretense that her marriage was rock solid. But this time, the script went off book. "Sarah? Is that really you?" She turned toward a voice that felt like a ghost from another life. Standing there was Nick, the same Nick she'd known back in college. Time had been incredibly kind to him. He had that same confident, piercing gaze and the kind of easy smile that used to drive her crazy in her early 20s. He looked like he had just stepped off the set of a high-end commercial. "Nick? My God, it's been forever." Her voice was a little higher than she intended, a mix of genuine shock and a sudden rush of adrenaline. He gave her a light, lingering hug, and the faint scent of his woodsy cologne immediately transported Sarah back to a time when her life was full of possibilities. "You haven't changed a bit," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "And you're still a world-class flatterer," she laughed, trying to mask the sudden flutter of nerves in her chest. They found a small high-top table in a quiet corner away from the noise of the auction. The conversation flowed with an ease that felt dangerous, as if the 2 decades since their graduation had never happened. Nick explained that he was now running a successful network of boutique art galleries and had flown into the OC for some meetings. Sarah found herself listening intently, laughing at his stories of scouting talent in New York and his travels through Europe, realizing that for the first time in years, she felt like a woman, interesting and desired, rather than just a wife and a mother. "So what does your world look like these days?" he asked, leaning back and giving her his full attention. Sarah hesitated. Her daily routine of errands and carpools suddenly felt incredibly small compared to Nick's vibrant, jet-setting life. "Oh, you know. I am keeping the wheels on the bus. The house, the kids. James is a partner at his firm now, so he's basically married to the office," she said, forcing a smile, though her voice lacked conviction. "Sounds like a lot," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "But you were always the one with the spark, Sarah. The one who was always searching for something bigger." His words hit her like a physical weight. He had noticed something in her that no one else had seen in years, not even herself. The rest of the night vanished in a blur. Nick took her number, mentioning they should grab a cup of coffee and catch up properly while he was in town. When Sarah finally pulled the SUV into her driveway, the house was dark, the kids were fast asleep, and James was, as usual, still hunched over his desk in the home office. She stood in the entryway for a long time, holding her heels in her hand, staring at the closed door of his study. For the first time in a very long time, she felt like her life was on the verge of a massive shift. The days that followed felt like she was walking through a fog. After that gala, Sarah and Nick started texting more frequently, though she kept telling herself it was just an innocent friendship with an old flame. Their first real meeting happened at a trendy, secluded cafe in the center of town. Sarah had spent an hour convincing herself that it was just two old friends catching up on the good old days. Nick arrived a few minutes early and had already snagged a table by the window. He looked comfortable, belonging perfectly to the chic environment of the cafe. "I am really glad you came," he said, standing up to help her with her trench coat. "Well, you know. I can never turn down a good cup of coffee," Sarah replied with a light smile, trying to sound as casual as possible. The talk between them was effortless. They reminisced about their university days, laughing over half-forgotten inside jokes and the drama of their old social circle. Nick knew how to listen. He kept his eyes locked on hers, giving her a sense of absolute importance that she had been starving for. "When was the last time you actually sat down and painted?" Nick asked suddenly, taking a sip of his black coffee. Sarah looked at him, completely caught off guard. "Oh man. I honestly can't even remember. Probably before Sam was born, maybe even longer. I remember how you used to spend 10 hours straight in the studio, completely oblivious to the world." "Your work was stunning, Sarah," he said, his tone carrying a hint of genuine sadness. "That was a lifetime ago, Nick. My life it's just different now," she replied, looking down at the table. But his words had sparked something, a small flame of identity that she thought had been extinguished years ago. The following weeks turned into a whirlwind. Their meetings became a regular fixture in her schedule, a quick coffee in the morning, a phone call in the afternoon while she was running errands, and sometimes even a lunch that stretched on for 2 hours. Sarah justified it to herself by saying Nick was just an old friend, a person who allowed her to relax and be the version of herself that didn't have to worry about PDA meetings or mortgage payments. One afternoon, they met at a contemporary art gallery where Nick was looking at some new pieces for his collection. Sarah accepted the invite, though in her gut, she knew this was becoming more than just a trip down memory lane. The gallery was small but incredibly chic, with soaring white walls and soft, natural light that made every painting look like a masterpiece. Nick spoke about each artist with so much passion that Sarah found it impossible to look away from him. "You have to see this one," he said, leading her over to a large abstract canvas covered in bold strokes of crimson and gold. "It feels like a total explosion of emotion, don't you think?" Sarah stared at the painting, but her thoughts were miles away. The sense of absolute freedom she felt whenever she was with him was becoming more powerful than anything she had experienced in a decade. "You can still be that girl, Sarah," he said softly, as if he could see right through her. "What girl?" she asked, trying to hide how much his words were shaking her. "The one who's free. The one who's real. You're still her, deep down. You just let yourself forget for a while." At home, the atmosphere remained stagnant. James would stumble in late, often forgetting to eat the dinner shed left out for him. On the rare occasions they actually sat in the same room, the conversation was strictly logistical. "Can you pick up Grace from soccer practice? Or did Sam finish his science project?" Sarah was beginning to feel like she was living in two parallel universes. With Nick, her world was vibrant, filled with light, art, and raw emotion. With James, it felt like she was sinking into a swamp where every single day was an exact carbon copy of the one before it. "You've been looking really happy lately," her friend Carol mentioned one morning while they were grabbing smoothies. "Did you start a new workout class or something?" "Just trying to stay in shape, you know how it is," Sarah lied, though she knew the truth was written all over her face. But even these small changes didn't catch James' eye. He was far too preoccupied with his quarterly projections and his corporate ladder, using his work as a bunker to hide from the reality of his own life. One evening, Nick sent her a text that made her heart race. "Do you have some time tomorrow? I want to show you a place." Sarah stared at the glowing screen for a long time. She knew she should say no. She knew she was standing on the edge of a cliff. But instead, Her fingers flew across the glass and typed out a single word, yes. The next day, he drove her out toward the canyons, winding up into a secluded park that overlooked a quiet, shimmering lake. They sat on a weathered wooden bench, and Nick spun stories about his travels, about the eclectic people he'd met in small coastal villages and the time he'd actually gotten lost in the thick, old-growth forests of Europe. Sarah laughed, a genuine light-hearted sound she hadn't made in years, but when she caught his eye, her breath hitched in her throat. It was that exact moment when the line between an old friendship and something far more dangerous began to blur into nothingness. "Sarah, you know you're one of a kind, right?" he said, his voice low and steady. She turned her face toward the water, feeling her cheeks flush a deep crimson. "Nick, don't." Her voice wavered, barely a whisper. "Why not? Because it's the truth?" He leaned a fraction closer, though he didn't touch her. The world seemed to stop for a heartbeat. Sarah knew that if she allowed herself to cross this line, there would be no turning back, no way to unring the bell. But for some reason, the internal alarm that usually kept her in check was silent. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Their eyes locked, and Sarah felt a sensation she had long since buried, a frantic fluttering in her chest that sat somewhere between pure terror and magnetic attraction. Nick sat incredibly close, his face bathed in the soft golden light of the setting sun. In that light, he looked not just confident, but strangely vulnerable. "You've always been the one, Sarah," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was husky, almost a secret. Sarah swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked away, trying to pull her emotions back behind the wall she'd built, but the tension between them only pulled tighter. "Nick, this is wrong," she whispered, but the words lacked any real conviction. "What's wrong? Feeling something? Actually being alive for once?" He leaned in a little more, though he stayed just an inch away from making contact. His words hit her like a physical blow, stripping away her defenses. She had spent so many years suppressing every part of herself that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist in the moment. She looked back out at the lake, where the water caught the dying light in 1,000 tiny glimmers, a perfect reflection of her own thoughts, restless, anxious, but undeniably beautiful. "I have a family, Nick. I have Grace and Sam." She started, but her voice broke. "I know. And I am not asking for anything. I just want you to know that you deserve to be happy, Sarah." "That's it," he said, his voice soft but carrying a sincere weight. Those words made her shudder. No one had asked her if she was happy in a decade. No one had wondered what was going on behind her polite smiles at the country club. Nick reached out and very lightly brushed his fingers against hers. It was the most delicate of touches, but a wave of heat surged through Sarah's entire body. She didn't pull her hand away, but she didn't reach back either. They sat there in a heavy silence, surrounded only by the sounds of the evening breeze and the rhythm of their own breathing. "Nick, she began, but in that exact second, her phone began to buzz in her purse. She jumped as if she'd been caught, frantically digging the device out. The caller ID flashed with Jameis' name. Sarah stared at the screen, feeling the weight of 1,000 judgments. "You going to get that?" Nick asked quietly, withdrawing his hand and looking away to give her a sense of privacy. She nodded and hit the green icon. "Hey James," she said, trying with everything she had to sound like the woman who had left the house that morning. "Hey, where are you? Grace can't find her soccer cleats for practice tomorrow, and Sam says his MacBook is acting up again. Are you going to be home soon?" "Yeah, I am just wrapping things up," she replied, feeling the cold splash of reality hitting her way too hard. "All right. Try not to be too late," James said, and then the line went dead. He hadn't asked where she was or who she was with. He just needed her to fix the house. She tucked the phone away and looked at Nick. His expression was calm, but there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "You need to get back," he said, standing up from the bench. "Yeah." Sarah stood, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. They walked slowly back to the car. Nick didn't touch her again, but his presence felt like a physical pressure against her skin. When they reached her SUV, he opened the door for her and searched her eyes. "Thanks for the evening, Sarah. I really just wanted you to remember who you actually are." She couldn't find the words to answer. She just sat in the driver's seat, avoiding his gaze. As she started the engine, Nick tapped on the glass. She rolled the window down. "If you ever want to just talk again, you know how to reach me," he said, giving her that specific smile that made her heart skip. Sarah drove away, but the ghost of that lake shore followed her all the way home. She knew she had stepped into a danger zone, and she knew there might not be a way out. The night was unexpectedly warm for November in Southern California. Sarah stared at the city lights from the window of a boutique hotel room that Nick had booked, just so they could sit and talk without the world watching. But the talking had stopped an hour ago. Now she stood by the window, wrapped only in a crisp white sheet, feeling two warring emotions tearing at her soul, pure euphoria and crushing guilt. It had started like any of their other meetings. Nick had invited her to a gallery opening, which turned into a glass of wine at a quiet lounge, which eventually turned into this room. Sarah knew that the moment they crossed the line wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of every choice she'd made since that first night at the gala. "What's going through that head of yours?" Nick asked softly, stepping up behind her. His voice was like velvet in the quiet room. She turned slightly, feeling the heat radiating from him. He stood right there, dressed only in his slacks, his shirt tossed carelessly over a nearby armchair. "I'm thinking about what I've done," she replied, her voice barely audible. "You haven't done anything," he said, reaching up to gently tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "You were just being honest with yourself for the first time." The words were meant to be a comfort, but in Sarah's mind, she could hear the voice of James, her husband, the man who came home to their kids every single night. James might not have looked at her the way Nick did, but he was her family. He was her anchor. She pulled away slightly, clutching the sheet tighter to her chest as if she could shield herself from her own conscience. "Nick, this was a mistake," she finally said. "Is that what you really think?" He looked directly into her eyes, his face showing no judgment, only a calm curiosity. "Yes," she said, looking away. "I have a family. I can't do this." "But you already did, Sarah," he said, staying exactly where he was. She felt her knees go weak and sank into a nearby armchair, trying to pull the fragmented pieces of her life back together. Nick walked over, sat on the edge of the bed opposite her, and handed her a glass of water. "I don't want you to torture yourself. This wasn't some grand plan, but we both wanted it. You deserve to be happy." There were those words again. They sounded like a lifeline, but they felt like a weight. They suggested that Nick saw something in her that she was too terrified to acknowledge. "It's not that simple, Nick," she whispered. "I have James, I have the kids. I can't just burn everything down." He stayed silent, letting her sit with the weight of it. Then he said quietly, "I am not asking you to. But I think you already know what you want." When Sarah finally made it back to the house, the clock on the dashboard showed it was after midnight. The neighborhood was silent, with only the dim glow from James' office window cutting through the dark. She crept up the stairs, moving like a ghost so she wouldn't wake Grace or Sam. When she reached the master bedroom, she leaned against the wall to pull off her heels, and a sudden violent wave of guilt crashed over her. What had happened felt both intensely real and like a fever dream. She looked at the bed she and James had shared for the last 15 years, and she realized the betrayal wasn't just physical. By the next morning, the world had reset into its cold mechanical rhythm. James had hauled himself out of the house and into the office even earlier than usual, leaving a scribbled post-it note on the kitchen island, "Don't forget to pick up Grace from soccer practice." Sarah stood in the kitchen, staring at the neon yellow square of paper, feeling a profound sense of emptiness. She had almost expected her internal turmoil to be visible on her skin, some mark of the betrayal that anyone could see, but the world just kept spinning as if nothing had happened. Nobody noticed a thing. Throughout the following week, her phone became a constant source of anxiety. Nick sent text after text, but Sarah left them all on read. She tried to scrub the memories of that night from her brain, but it was like trying to wash out a permanent stain. Every time the haptic vibration buzzed against her thigh, her heart did a painful, nauseating somersault. One morning, as she walked out to her SUV to drop Grace off at school, she spotted Nick's car parked directly across the street. He was leaning against the hood, looking effortless in the California sun, with that same unshakable, easy smile on his face. "Nick, what on earth are you doing here?" she asked, stopping dead on the sidewalk. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," he replied, his tone casual but his eyes searching. "You can't just show up at my house like this," she said, her voice sharp with panic. Despite her anger, She could feel a familiar warm wave of heat rushing through her body just by being near him. "I know, but you're not answering my texts, and I really just want to talk to you." "We don't have anything left to talk about," Sarah replied, glancing nervously around the neighborhood to make sure none of the stay-at-home moms or the gardeners were watching them. "Sarah, that's not true," he said, stepping a little closer but making sure not to touch her. "I know exactly what you're feeling right now, because I'm feeling it too." Her eyes immediately filled with tears, but she brushed them away before they could fall. "I can't do this, Nick. I have a family. I have a whole life here. But do you have yourself?" His voice was quiet, but it hit her with the force of a tidal wave. Those words pierced right through her. Nick got back into his car and drove away, leaving her standing alone on the sidewalk, feeling the entire reality of her life crumbling under its own weight. Sarah knew she had to make a choice, but every single option felt like an impossible dead end. The following morning was surprisingly still, as if nature itself knew that the day was going to be a turning point. Sarah woke up to the faint sound of the bedroom door creaking open. James walked in, not with his laptop or a work file, but with 2 steaming mugs of coffee from their Nespresso machine. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes, but his face carried a look of rare determination. "Good morning," he said, handing her one of the mugs. "Morning," Sarah replied, sitting up against the headboard. She realized with a jolt that she couldn't remember the last time James had actually brought her coffee in bed. He sat down on the edge of the mattress, took a long, heavy breath, and looked directly at her. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," he began. "And I know I haven't exactly been the best husband." Sarah froze, her fingers tightening around the warm ceramic of the mug. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was guarded, her chest tight with a mix of fear and confusion. "About us. About how far we've drifted apart," James said, looking her in the eye. "I feel like we've become roommates who just share a mortgage, rather than a real family." The words stung because of how honest they were. Sarah knew he was right. "I want to fix this," he continued. "I took a few personal days off next week. Let's just get out of town. Just you and me. No kids, no work." Sarah hadn't seen this coming at all. James never did anything spontaneous, especially not something that involved taking time away from the office. She knew what the right answer was supposed to be, but her mind immediately flashed back to Nick. I don't know, James," she said, trying to buy herself a moment of clarity. "Please," he said, reaching out to gently touch her hand. "Just give us one more shot." His sincerity was what finally broke her. She couldn't look him in the eye, knowing that just a few days ago, she had been in a hotel room with another man. "Okay," she finally managed to whisper. James smiled, and for a second, his face seemed to light up with a genuine sense of hope. Later that afternoon, while James was in his home office finishing up some last-minute emails, Sarah sat at the kitchen island with her phone in her hand. Her fingers were trembling as she stared at the screen. She knew that writing this message was the only way she could even attempt to move forward. Finally, gathering every bit of strength she had left, she opened the chat with Nick. "Nick, I can't keep doing this. I have a family to think about. I'm sorry." The message felt so final, so cold. She hit send and felt her heart physically stop for a second. Her phone vibrated almost instantly. "Are you sure this is what you really want?" His reply was short, but every single letter felt like a physical blow. She shut the phone off and threw it onto the counter, unable to even look at the screen anymore. The next few days were a blur of packing and getting the house ready. James had booked a high-end cabin up in Lake Arrowhead, a place they used to visit back before the kids were born. Sarah tried her best to focus on the plans, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Nick's question. Still, James was clearly trying. He was showing her that he wanted to win her back, and she felt like she owed it to their 15 years together to at least try. The cabin was perfect. It had those classic cedar walls, a massive stone fireplace, and the crisp scent of pine trees. It reminded her of the days when they were actually happy. On their first night there, they sat by the fire. James poured them both a glass of a bold Napa Cabernet and started telling stories from his childhood that she hadn't heard in years. Sarah forced a smile, but her heart felt like it was being pulled in 2 different directions. "What's on your mind?" James asked suddenly, his voice soft but tinged with a bit of worry. Just thinking about how long it's been since we really did this, she said, gesturing to the wine and the fire. I know, he nodded slowly. I think I forgot what it was like to just be with you. His words hit her with a painful honesty. She wanted to feel something powerful and pure, but everything inside her was a tangled mess. That night, for the first time in a very long time, they fell asleep in each other's arms. It felt like the start of something new, or at least a desperate attempt to fix what was broken. The next morning, once James had left for the Spectrum and the kids were safely on the school bus, Sarah sat at the kitchen table and pulled out the photo again. She stared at it, her eyes darting between Nick's face, her own guilty expression, and those chilling words on the back. She decided she had to call Nick. Sarah, his voice was quiet, almost soothing when he picked up. We need to meet, she said, cutting him off. Right now. They met at a nondescript diner on the far edge of the county, a place where they were unlikely to run into anyone they knew. Nick was already in a corner booth, and his face immediately tightened when he saw her walk in. What happened? He asked as she silently slid the photograph across the table. Nick looked at the image for a long time, then raised his eyes to hers. Damn. Was all he said. Who could have done this? She whispered, her voice trembling. Nick shook his head, his expression turning thoughtful. I don't know. No one should have known. Except who? She pressed, her voice cracking. I've been having some trouble with one of the employees at the gallery, he began. She was a bit obsessive. It's possible she followed me. Obsessive. Sarah felt a mix of white-hot anger and cold fear bubbling in her chest. Are you telling me that because of your drama, this woman now knows everything about me? Nick tried to reach for her hand, but Sarah flinched away. I'll handle it, I promise, he said, looking her straight in the eye. You better handle it fast, Nick. I have a family, she hissed, standing up to leave. Back at the house, Sarah was a wreck. She checked the deadbolt on the front door, locked every window, and even checked the feed on the Nest cameras James had installed a couple of years ago. Her internal world was splitting at the seams. Later that evening, James came home from work looking exhausted, but he immediately noticed her state. Is everything all right? He asked, tossing his blazer onto a chair.
Yeah, everything's fine.
Just a long day, Sarah replied, trying her best to look composed. James nodded and headed toward his study, but his gaze lingered on her a few seconds longer than usual. Sarah tried to distract herself, but it was impossible. She kept playing the photograph over in her mind, over and over. I know. Who was it? What did they want? Her phone buzzed. It was Nick. Sarah, I talked to her. She swears it wasn't her. I don't believe her, but I don't have any proof. Great, she replied sarcastically. Then who was it? I'll figure it out.
Juste don't panique. Don't panique?
Do you have any idea what's at stake here? If James finds out. Her voice rose. Sarah, I'll take care of it, he interrupted. She hung up and threw the phone onto the sofa. Later that night, she heard James coming up the stairs. Her heart stopped when he walked into the bedroom. Are you sure you're okay? He asked, looking at her with an uncharacteristically serious expression. Yes, James, just tired, she repeated. He didn't say another word, but the look in his eyes told her that he was picking up on something. It all came to a head the next morning. Sarah felt a heavy, piercing gaze on her. She was standing by the kitchen window, filling the kettle, when she noticed James standing in the doorway, just watching her in silence. There was something new in his eyes, a kind of grim resolve she hadn't seen in years. Good morning, she said, trying to keep her voice level. We need to talk, James replied, not breaking eye contact. The words felt like a thunderclap in the quiet kitchen. Sarah froze, her fingers trembling against the handle of the kettle. Of course, she said, setting the kettle down and wiping her hands, fighting to stay calm. James sat down at the table, crossing his arms. I know, Sarah. Her heart skipped a beat. The room went silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Know what? Her voice came out far too weak. About you and Nick, he said calmly, though the usual confidence was missing from his tone. Sarah sat down across from him. Her head spun, and the air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thick to breathe. How? She exhaled. I hired a private investigator, James admitted, looking down at his hands. When I started noticing the change in you, I couldn't just sit back and not understand what was happening. The words hit her like an electric shock. Her worst fears were confirmed, but she couldn't believe James had actually gone to such lengths. You had me followed? She asked, her voice shaking with a cocktail of anger and shame. Yes, he said, finally looking up. I knew you wouldn't tell me the truth. Sarah was speechless. Inside her, two emotions were at war, a burning rage over the violation of her privacy and the crushing weight of guilt because he was right. I wasn't going to make a scene. I was the one who sent you that photo, Sarah, James admitted, his voice cracking for the first time. I know it was cruel. I hated myself the moment I dropped it in the mail. But I was losing you, and every time I tried to reach out normally, you weren't there. I was desperate. I wanted to see if you still cared enough about us to be honest when the truth was staring you in the face. I didn't know how else to break the wall between us, he continued, his voice remaining low and almost gentle. Why, James? Just to rub it in my face? She asked, looking him in the eye for the first time, her voice raw with pain. No, he shook his head. To understand what happened to us. The silence settled over them again. Sarah lowered her gaze, feeling her entire life turning to ash. I made a mistake, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. It wasn't just a mistake, Sarah, he said. It was a cry for help. I see that now. She looked up at him. There was no rage in his eyes, only a deep, profound exhaustion and sadness. Why didn't you just talk to me? He asked softly. The question cut deep. I tried, James, she replied, her voice breaking. But you never listened. You were never there. I know, he said, rubbing his face with his hand. I lost you, Sarah. And I realize that's on me. She watched him, her heart aching at the sound of his words. What do you want from me? She asked. I want to fix us, he replied, looking her in the eye. We've been together for 15 years. You were my family, my whole world. I don't want to lose you. James stood up and walked over to her, dropping to his knees. It was so unexpected and so out of character to see him this vulnerable. Sarah, I know this is going to be incredibly difficult. But if you're willing, I want to try again. Her eyes filled with tears. She didn't know what to say. She wanted to scream that everything was too broken, that she wasn't sure of her own feelings anymore, but the sincerity in his eyes moved her to her core. It's not that easy, James, she finally said. I know, he replied. But I'm willing to fight for you, if you'll give me the chance. That evening, Sarah sat alone in the bedroom for a long time. James' words were echoing in her head. He knew. He had known the whole time. But instead of burning their life down, he had reached out his hand. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Nick, I'm still here if you want to talk. Sarah put the phone in the drawer. Her head was pounding, and her heart was caught between the past and the future. A soft knock at the door broke her trance. James peeked into the room. Are you okay? He asked quietly. She nodded. Yeah, just thinking. He walked in and sat beside her. His presence was warm and strangely grounding. We'll figure it out, he said, taking her hand. She nodded again, but deep down, she knew that this choice was going to be the hardest one of her entire life. Several months have gone by since that night that shook the foundations of everything. Sarah's life was no longer that suffocating gray routine she had endured for so long. But the change wasn't some chaotic storm of drama. Instead, it was a sense of harmony she never thought she'd find again in their home. After their raw, honest talk, James did the one thing she had desperately wanted but never felt she could ask for. He actually started listening. Not just hearing the words, but listening to her emotions, her long-shot dreams, and her deepest fears. The first few weeks were brutal. Sarah laid it all out, the crushing loneliness, how she'd met Nick, and how that brief affair had made her feel like she finally mattered again. She had braced herself for the absolute worst, screaming matches, legal threats, or a cold, silent divorce proceeding. But James caught her off guard. I can't change the past, Sarah, he had told her one evening while they were sitting out on the patio with 2 glasses of wine. But I have total control over what happens from here on out. He was the one who pushed for marriage counseling. At first, Sarah was skeptical that a therapist in a plush office could fix 15 years of drift. During those first few sessions, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, both of them terrified of saying the wrong thing. But slowly, those uncomfortable hours in the therapist's chair peeled back the layers of their relationship. Sarah talked about feeling like she was trapped in a gilded cage. James, in turn, admitted that his obsession with climbing the corporate ladder in the tech world was just a mask for his own deep-seated insecurities. I was terrified that I wasn't enough for you, that I couldn't provide the life you deserved unless I gave it everything, he confessed during one particularly heavy session. Those words left Sarah stunned. It had never crossed her mind that a man as successful as James could feel so small. Bit by bit, they began to rediscover the small, simple things that had glued them together in the beginning. Instead of disappearing into separate corners of the house with their devices, they started making dinner together, experimenting with recipes they found on the Food Network. They took long walks through the neighborhood trails and even went to a spontaneous outdoor concert at the local park to hear a jazz band. But the final closure for Sarah came in the form of a handwritten letter from Nick. It arrived a few weeks after she had completely cut off all contact and blocked his number. In the letter, he thanked her for the time they spent together and mentioned he was moving out of the state to open a new gallery in Santa Fe. "You made me a better man, Sarah," he wrote in his familiar bold script. "But your life belongs with your family. I truly hope you find the peace you've been looking for." Reading those words felt like a final period at the end of a long, messy chapter. She realized that while Nick had been a vital part of her journey back to herself, he had no place in her future. One evening, after Grace and Sam were tucked in and the house was quiet, James joined her on the deck with 2 mugs of steaming herbal tea. "I was thinking about taking next Friday off," he said, giving her a soft, genuine smile. "You? A Friday? That's definitely a first for the corporate world," Sarah teased, nudging him with her shoulder. "I just want to spend the day with you. Just the 2 of us. Maybe a drive up the coast," he said. She smiled, taking his hand in hers and feeling the warmth of his grip. "That sounds absolutely perfect." In that moment, she realized they really had started over. Their life was far from a fairy tale, but it finally had the things she valued most: honesty, attention, and a real grounded love. Deep down in her soul, Sarah knew she had made the right choice. The tragedy of this situation lies in the hero's fundamental mistake. He traded genuine presence for material provision, assuming that a high 6-figure shield could protect his domestic front. He treated his marriage like a corporate task that was settled, leaving a psychological vacuum that an old flame was only too happy to fill. To avoid this, first, remember that provider status does not grant immunity to betrayal. Emotional neglect is the most fertile soil for infidelity. Second, trust your intuition. If the silence in your home starts echoing, it's not peace, it is a warning. Finally, if you discover a breach of trust, act with the calculated resolve shown in this case rather than raw emotion. How would you have reacted if you were the one holding that photograph? Write your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more honest psychological case studies.